Is it time to get off the Adobe train? I've been using Adobe software, more specifically Photoshop, for what must be 25 years now. And my relationship, my experience with this company has never been great. I would describe it loosely as an abusive relationship. It's never been fun, and this company has always been a problem, despite building some of the best creative software. Right now, in June 2024, there is a lot of outrage against Adobe, which is, in most cases, warranted. I think it is worth considering if you're just starting out, trying to look at what software you should use. The question is, should you go and jump on the Adobe train, given that it could be going in some bad direction? It could be headed to some dystopian AI hellscape. We just don't really know. And also, if you've been using it for years and years and years, like I have, is this time to get off? Is it time to just finally quit because we just don't have confidence in this company? Not just that there's some AI nonsense going on, but that really they have tended to kind of move away from really supporting creatives and also actually supporting a lot of professionals and what professionals actually need out of software. I think it's important to consider the way that as users of software, we create interesting, unique, symbiotic relationships with these companies. And we really want to look at what a good version of that is. What is the perfect version of us using software as artists and people developing that software for us? Should we be paying for it? Should we pay a little bit? Should it be a subscription model? Should we pay a lot for it? How should that work? And is Adobe even that cutting edge? I think there's a lot of questions here that we can look at to try and understand what software, should be, what Adobe is as a company, and how we can look at the whole AI issue and how that signals both how they're going as a company and also whether or not we want to be a part of that. As I said, I really think that making decisions in outrage, making them in anger is not a good idea. It is not going to lead to good strategic outcomes. It's easy for history to just repeat itself, to jump out of the frying pan into the fire, so to speak. And going forward, I think that we are going to see a much more closer symbiotic relationship with users of software and applications and services with that product. And a lot of what you have seen up to now, where corporate stakeholders become the shareholders and we get cut out as customers, I really do think that that era is coming to an end. Maybe not right now, but I think in the future it will be. And in order for that future to be good, we, as users of software, have to understand our role and what it takes to make and help companies build good software. Welcome to the Visual Scholar podcast. My name's Tim Mcburnie. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, much of that using Photoshop from Adobe. And on this show, we're all about demystifying the worlds of art, creativity, and productivity so that you can get better faster and enjoy your artistic journey. All right, a little bit of a preface here so that I can kind of just describe where I'm coming from with this. I really dislike just the general sort of drama and headline stuff in the internet, but especially in the art community. I think it's just so important for us to focus on making art. I think in the long term, that's what's going to make you the most happy. And it's very easy to get super outraged and frustrated when we see these big corporations and software that we use and we're paying for these companies to kind of turn around and really sort of cannibalize our market and go against the things that, we're trying to do as creatives. I think it is easy to get outraged by that stuff and rightly so. But I think, pouring kerosene on the fire is not a good idea. I think it's really important to just think about what we should be doing and try and find some sort of positive situation, some positive mindset where we're actually moving towards a future that does support us as artists and not just reacting. Again, reactionary stuff is just never good. It's never going to end in a good solution. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. It's also important to note that one of the keys here you're going to find is that, look, quite frankly, a lot of people are just beginning. The most people who use this type of software are not really making enough money with it to sort of justify paying quite high prices. And a lot of people are just kind of wanting to play around with this software. And they just want to use it maybe now and then, and paying this monthly subscriptions, it just doesn't work, right? And that's certainly the case for me when I use software that isn't art-based. I don't want to pay these subscription fees for it. I just want to kind of have it lying around. But this is all about where you come from. And I think depending on whether or not you are a professional, whether you're a really successful professional where, just the prices don't matter, these things are sort of more or less important. And the same with AI, right? Everyone's going to come at this from different perspectives. Some people are going to be really emotionally engaged with the ethical, moral things. So one of the things I actually want to do is try and unpack some of the moral and ethical issues that I think surround the entire usage of software and how we sort of deal with these companies. Because again, I really think there is a lot of naivete in terms of looking at what happens when you get cheap or free stuff. When you get cheap or free stuff, you often are the product. You often get sold down the river. I think it's a little bit depressing that Adobe is charging you a lot of money and then selling your data as well, essentially. And again, some of the stuff we'll unpack is looking at Adobe's other business models, other business segments, because again, one of the interesting things is they are very much involved in big data and data brokering, right? It's one of the things they actually do as sort of the non-creative side of their business. So I'm going to try and unpack a lot of this. I'm not necessarily going to come up with some, hey, you should do this or hey, you should do that. I have certainly canceled my Adobe Creative Cloud subscription a couple of times because I get sick of it. I've got one right now, and I'll talk a little bit about, sort of how I think of it. But mostly this is just to arm us with a little bit more clear thought and to really get at that issue, which I think is important, which is what should we be doing? Like when we say we want to look at a particular piece of software and we want to sort of swap to something, what should we be swapping to? And how should we try and help to build that software into what we want it to be? What does that ideal future look like? So firstly, let's look at software itself. Now, I guess this is just an exercise in really brainstorming and just looking at what software means to us as professionals. It's very easy when you're really annoyed at a company, and I've done this before. You just get annoyed at some subscription or some price, and then you just go and sort of cancel it. I've done this before with my Adobe Creative Cloud, all apps thing. I was just like, I'm not using half of this stuff. I'm paying so much for this. I'm sick of this. And then I kind of go on some, rabbit hole adventure where I kind of try and look at all the different options and sort of play around with it. And I guess what I'd like to share with you is how earlier on in my career with Corel Painter, I did that to a really large degree. And then I kind of went back to Photoshop because I sort of realized that it's really just important to focus on making art. And often the software is just a tool, right? And it really doesn't make that much difference. So there is a utility value here. And it's easy to kind of get frustrated at it and just be like, I'm going to swap. But we often don't look when you're reacting out of outrage. You don't really look where you're going. You just look at what you're moving away from. And I think there's a lot of good things about Photoshop as a program, not necessarily linked to all the stuff that surrounds it, that really does make it unique. And I think it is like far and away the best software for doing this. It has the most features. It has the most things. So you may be saying, that's nonsense. We don't need it. Let's try and unpack that. But firstly, again, just to go back to this idea of looking at what happened to me with Corel Painter and Photoshop. So this is a good example of where if we're not really looking at ourselves and what we're actually trying to do, it's very easy to kind of just go chasing the next hot thing. So for me, very early on, one of the interesting things about the evolution of digital art was when you went from Star Wars Episode 1 art book came out. And this was one of these seminal art books. It was such a good art book. Back when an art book really meant something, right? It really had, it felt like really curated. And back then, again, I just feel like the art was really good. It just was an amazing thing to see this new Star Wars art. Anyway, little bit of a rabbit hole here. But then the second one came out. Episode 2, Attack of the Clones art book came out. And that really changed everything for me. And I think for a lot of people in the aspiring concept art industry. Because I wasn't really good enough to be considered at working at Lucasfilm at that point in time, right? That was like nowhere near it. These were the people who were leading the charge, And you could see through the concept art on Star Wars, Episode 1, Episode 2, Episode 3, the level that was kind of required and also the evolution of the tools and techniques that were being used. And if you look at the art books currently, again, you see also the evolution of a lot of concept art tools. There's a lot more 3D now than there was back then. In the first Episode 1 art book, and I am going here with this, it was mostly traditional. It was marker sketches. There may have been some adjustments in Photoshop, but back then, Photoshop just wasn't the best tool. I mean, if you look at the amazing Doug Chang, who was part of the art direction on that sort of first Episode 1 film, he was doing a lot of this concept painting in acrylic. And this was traditional, typical Star Wars style, sort of Ralph McQuarrie style art. And it was amazing. It was really good. I mean, I still think that Episode 1 art book is like so freaking good. And the rest of it was marker work and very basic, but it was amazing. The second book, but at that time, again, a lot of us were trying to figure out how to paint digitally using Photoshop. The second book comes out, Attack of the Clones, and you had a lot of new artists who were working on it. And in particular, the artist I remember the most was Ryan Church. And Ryan Church was using Painter. And a lot of these people working on the Star Wars thing seemed to be using Painter, Corel Painter instead of Photoshop. And they had this just amazing painterly look. And it was really hard at that time to get that sort of feel with Photoshop. It was much more natural. And I think, again, the obvious thing is that Ryan Church is just really good. And back then, he was really good at sort of figuring out a process that kind of really worked with Corel Painter. And, but you could just see the evolution of digital art coming online with that Attack of the Clones art book, right? All of a sudden, it was mostly digital, right? And it was all Corel Painter. And so I just thought, Corel Painter is it. This is the future. This is what I want. All these guys are so good. This is kind of what I want to do. So I started using Corel Painter. I got pretty good at using it. I looked at all the tutorials. I kind of learned how they were doing what they were doing. My art still didn't get that much better. Surprise, surprise. But I think, again, it just sort of speaks to how, the tool is not that important, obviously, which is not really the subject here. But the key thing that was a problem with Corel Painter was not Corel Painter. It was the fact that it had bugs. And the reason that I kind of went on these little traversals, and you would sort of look at this program and say, hey, this is so good, I'm just going to swap. And then you use it and you're like, oh yeah, it's got this thing's good and this thing's bad. But I think one of the things we're going to talk about that we really need out of software is reliability. And Corel Painter was not reliable. Now, a lot of things weren't reliable back then, and a lot of things aren't reliable here still today. A lot of, top apps like Maya, and even sort of ZBrush, Photoshop, these things are buggy. They still do crash. I feel like that's probably the number one problem that these software companies should be dealing with. But Corel Painter had this really nice bug. And this is the reason that I stopped using Corel Painter and I'll never use it again. And that I kind of got sick of playing around with different applications. Because again, we take for granted the fact that Photoshop was this industry standard thing and it didn't crash. But anyway, Corel Painter had this great bug where you're just working in Painter and doesn't matter what you're doing. It's not like you click on something. There's nothing. Out of the blue, the app just disappears. It goes poof, disappears into nothing. The file that you're working on is corrupted. It goes to 0 kilobytes. So you were previously working on a file, you open it up, it's like 200 megabytes, 100 megabytes. Painter disappears, your file goes to 0, it's corrupted, it's gone forever. There is nothing you can do at all. Your file is gone. What do you do? And so they just could not get rid of this bug. People complained. It had been in Corel Painter for many, many versions. They just could not, they either couldn't or wouldn't or whatever. They did not get rid of this thing. And the solution they had was to make a really easy way for you to save a version. So I have these old folders full of Corel Painter files where there's 50 versions of an illustration because you'd have to save as every time or save a copy. And they just made it easy. You just press a button and that just saved a copy. And that's the only way they could fix the bug. But that was so annoying and just so frustrating that I basically just gave up on it. I just kind of went back to Photoshop and I was like, look, this is not the best, but at least it doesn't crash. So that's a long lead in. What should we be looking for in terms of software? Well, I think obviously what I'm getting at is one of the things we do need is that it has good code. It's well written. It's stable, right? And I think that's sort of often taken for granted when we are using software that is stable and then you see something else that seems like it has similar features. It is a major problem and super frustrating and anti-creative and gets you out of flow to have your program crash. And it creates a lot of anxiety if you know that your program could crash at any time. Pretty obvious stuff. But I think the other thing we often need out of software that we should be looking for is a good learning resource. And this really is what makes the difference and what makes these things sort of good or bad. Now, I think most of the software that we're looking at that would replace Photoshop kind of has that, except for some of the open source things like sort of Critter. And there's a couple of others that I think people have sort of recommended. But what really makes software good, and this is something we'll unpack as well, it's not the software, it's the people who use it. And it's having that community around it so that it's easy for you to learn how to use it. And so that everyone kind of puts and heads the features in a direction that is good. So it's not just the software, but it's also the learning resources, the people who are around it, the community, the ethos, and just the fact that that community is going to hold the company accountable and that the company is kind of listening and aware of that community. So I think that's also something you need to look for with software. And there's a lot of software that seems pretty good out there, but you can just kind of tell it doesn't have that stuff surrounding it. And again, if you look at something like Procreate, I think one of the reasons it has become so popular is there is a great community around it. Plenty of people use it. There's lots of resources for learning how to use it. And that's actually what I think has made it really, really good. Okay, so I think it's also important to just look at there are going to be differences between what a professional is going to need versus what an amateur is going to need. And I think this really does boil down to a lot of the advice you might get. So this is all basic stuff, but we're just doing it to kind of clear the air. But I think the thing that is often not clear in the air is that people are giving advice like, hey, this thing is just as good as Photoshop. This thing replicates that. You don't need any of these features. That's true for that individual, but it's not true for most people. And one of the advantages of something like Photoshop is that it is going to be much, much more feature complete. And it's going to have a lot of these things that I'll talk about when we come to professional features that you don't need if you're just an illustrator, if you're a comic book artist. In many cases, if you're just handling the line work or even just the line work plus the color, maybe you don't need that stuff. If you're actually exporting a file from Photoshop that's going to send directly to a printer and no one else is looking at it, that's when you need to start thinking about some of these more professional features. But if you're just making JPEGs or you're making a flat file and you're sending that to someone, yeah, a lot of these programs will do that just fine. They handle everything. You're not importing and exporting anything too fancy. You're making art entirely in the program and you're exporting a JPEG or a flat uncompressed TIFF or something like that. Fine, right? These simple applications will do almost all of that. In that case, for a lot of comic book artists, it's essentially replicating pen and ink. It's just black and white. It's fairly easy in software to do a pretty good job of that. So again, that's really important to note is that often it's not that professional people who are using Photoshop are like better or they're needing these kind of features. It's often that Photoshop does a lot of stuff that is not to do with actually art, but does actually help in the production of things for print, illustrations, sort of video games, animation, etc., storyboarding. It's actually a very versatile tool that can kind of do almost everything. All right, what do you need as a pro? Like, what does Photoshop have that we need to look for as either someone who is a professional? You need to remember that we need these things, or if you're sitting here saying like, why am I learning Photoshop as opposed to something like Procreate or one of these other options? Because they seem to be doing exactly the same thing. Well, I think there's a couple of key things that will allow you to basically make Photoshop a lot better. And more importantly, if you can just learn one program that will do a bunch of things, that gives you a lot more power. You have to learn less different software. And I think this is actually super valuable because it allows you to do more art and focus less on learning applications, right? That's like even though applications are actually quite easy to learn, it is frustrating if you have to kind of keep track of different keyboard shortcuts and stuff. So for professionals, you really do need feature sort of production integration, right? Which means that often the way that Photoshop is going to export art is going to be much more specific to, sort of game engines. It's going to export very particular different types of images or sequences of images, these kind of things that can be really sort of key. And often, if you are working on little animations in Photoshop, for instance, your ability to kind of integrate and export a particular type of file en masse, right? This often works if you're sort of wrangling Photoshop as a storyboarding tool. You can just kind of export a whole bunch of files. It's quite easy to figure out what the names are of them. You can sort of add naming conventions to stuff. It's all this minutia that seems completely pointless if your goal is just to make a JPEG illustration. But if you don't have these things, it often means that you're stuck renaming a million files, or some production workflow just doesn't work because you can't actually make it function that way. So for instance, and again, this will tie into a couple of the other things we're going to talk about here, but you can really easily integrate and change Photoshop into a lot of things. And one of the things it can do pretty well is act as a storyboarding tool. Buying like sort of the professional storyboarding tools are quite expensive, a lot more expensive than Photoshop because they're very specific. They are probably better. They're probably a lot better. But if you're not doing storyboarding as a professional full time, you just need to do it every now and then, Photoshop can do quite a good job with layer comps, which again is something that most of these other software programs don't have. But then you can also just export layer comps to files, and you can then specify some sort of naming convention or sort of numbered prefix or all this kind of stuff that's actually super, super useful if you're actually doing this. So for instance, I working on a storyboard right now, and I have a whole bunch of, you're looking at like 100 layer comps in Photoshop, hundreds of layers. Like for every layer comp, there's probably like 3 or 4 actual layers. So you're looking at like hundreds and hundreds of layers that are being managed with different layer comps. It's quite complicated. It's a bit clunky, but it'll do it. And then I hit a keyboard shortcut, select some layer comps, and then that just sort of spits them out. And it spits them out to, a NAS drive that I have. And then I have this other workstation here behind me, which is more of like a video editing workstation. And I've got DaVinci Resolve on that. And that's linked to that same NAS drive where the little sort of JPEGs come out. So I kind of save my JPEGs in Photoshop, and they all just kind of magically appear in DaVinci Resolve because of the naming convention and the saving is kind of worked out. And that means that, I don't have to buy a whole bunch of storyboarding software. I can sort of use, again, just Photoshop and Resolve, which I know how to use. And it's just these little things that will help you with production. And that's not a workflow that anyone has told me how to do. I just kind of figured that out. I was like, I reckon this will work. And that's the kind of stuff that you're looking for in Photoshop that you're just not going to get in something like Procreate. It's quite possible that they would make a good storyboarding specific program that would kind of allow you to do everything. But again, the extensibility of Photoshop is key, which again is the sort of the second point here, which is the second thing you really want, as opposed, in addition to production integration, is extensibility, plugins, or scripting. And this really is another one of these things that you're not going to care about at all. But one of the ways you can really even speed up and make some of those production workflows for storyboarding even more efficient is by setting up some scripting, some basic actions. Maybe there might be some plugins you could install to make that even easier. And that way, if you kind of learn all these keyboard shortcuts, you set it up, you can make Photoshop into like a very efficient storyboarding program. And then within that, you have access to all of Photoshop's brush engine. You have access to all of Photoshop's selection engine, which is going to be a lot better than a lot of storyboard specific tools. You can also turn Photoshop into an animation software. And a lot of people do this. I know people who, they're animating their entire video game in Photoshop. I know people who have done the vast majority of a 2D animated, really high quality sort of short film in Photoshop. All the frames are done in Photoshop, and you set that up with actions and plugins, keyboard shortcuts, and you kind of just figure out how it works. And you can kind of turn Photoshop into that. Now, why is that important? Well, it's just this kind of cool tool where like now you can just do all that stuff in Photoshop. You can kind of paint the backgrounds there. You can animate in there. You obviously probably have to comp it in After Effects or something, put it into proper edit system, grading, etc. But, you can do a lot with just Photoshop. I use actions quite a bit with Photoshop when it comes to comic books. As a good example, when I was doing French comic books, I had all my files, so 100 pages, probably be 50 gigabytes of files or something like that, 50 to 100 gigabytes of files. And, they've got English text and French text in there on different layers. And I have an action that will turn off the English text and turn on the French text. And then I can export. And you could also set up an action to be like, okay, well, I want you to go through each file and turn off the English text, turn on the French text, export me a JPEG of it, call it this, put it in this folder, and then, close the file, don't save it. And then I can just run that action and it just goes right through 100 files, manages, it takes a while to open them. So you just walk away, you come back a few minutes later, or probably back then it would have been, 15 minutes later. And it's just done that. It's saved me a version of my comic in French. Send that off to my editor, make it a PDF in Bridge, right? Away you go. So, I think, again, it's important to understand that, yes, there are other things that do that, but nothing really does that as well as allow you to, make the actual art in the application and then do so many things with it. And it means that you can just learn Photoshop and you could potentially do 2D animated feature films. You could do storyboarding, you can do illustration, you can do comics, you can do it all within the one application through extensions, plugins, actions, scripting. And you don't even have to know how to do all of that stuff. People will give you systems and you can get all of that stuff for free. So extensibility, I think, is something that professionals often really use. And it's one of the things that just separates that software from a lot of the others. The next thing I think we really need as professionals, or people who are just serious, right? Like, these things can be important. Again, if you're just making your own comic, you want to kickstart your comic, you just want to make your own comic, you want to print one copy, you want to make stuff. These are the things that save you time. It saves you time so that you can get better at art, you can spend more time doing art, or you can, have more of your weekend to spend with your family, essentially. It really doesn't matter whether you're professional or not. It's just like whether you're serious and whether you're actually making stuff. The next thing, though, I think is important is real stability and reliability, which is actually one of my major beefs with Adobe. Yes, a lot of the stuff is frustrating, but the things that really affect me is the fact that they've moved to this subscription model and they have sort of tried to move away from this basic traditional studio workflow where you just don't upgrade software. And they kind of often Adobe makes you upgrade from Photoshop 2023 to 2024. And often they've broken stuff and they've made the software not reliable. They've introduced some bug. Everyone complains about it, but you even can't downgrade to the Photoshop where that's not a problem. Because often, maybe if you don't upgrade quick enough, often, like, I've been on Photoshop 2019, and then all of a sudden it gets to, it's sort of Photoshop 2022, and I upgrade because it kind of needs me to for some reason, or I just install on a new machine and it's completely broken for some reason. It just does some silly thing, but then I can't downgrade to 2019 or 2017 or like whatever. It's like I should be able to use whatever one I want that's the most reliable. Because again, often in production, you don't want to touch anything, right? If you're on deadline and you've got a million things you need to do, the last thing you want is to be wrangling software problems, because often things interact and sort of mess around. So this idea of updating things, breaking plugins, like making stuff like not work, is just sort of anti-professional, right? It's anti-people who want to get stuff done. I don't need new features in Photoshop. I just want it to be reliable. The other thing is they often don't actually fix that many bugs. There are still bugs in Photoshop. It's very annoying. But they have gotten better at not nuking the program. So often now when it crashes, it will still allow you to save files. It's very good at recovering. But yeah, fundamentally, I think reliability is really important. And what I often hear is, again, people talk about how great a software program is, and then they complain that it crashes or has a whole bunch of bugs. And again, I really think looking for something that has the least amount of bugs, the most reliability, is very, very important, especially from a professional point of view. And again, having a company that understands that and is going to build you reliable software that you don't have to update, that you can just, Ideally, I'd like to update Photoshop every 10 years. That's me, right? Maybe 5. 5's pushing it. Every year, you've got to be freaking kidding me. You have got to be absolutely raving, frothing at the mouth mad, crazy if you are expecting me to update anything every year, ever. It's ridiculous. The last thing here that I think is worth remembering is speed and productivity. So there are frequently ways that you can do things in software. And often what people will say, if you're looking at, hey, I'm using this, I'm kind of sick of it, I want to switch to this. But can I do XYZ thing? Can I, wrangle this particular task that I have in Photoshop? And again, I'm being very sort of vague. I'm not giving a lot of examples, but often people will say, yeah, you can do that. You can do that this way. But that way takes a lot longer because Photoshop has better ability to sort of modify actions or keyboard shortcuts. Again, there's a degree of scripting in Photoshop with actions where you can do a lot of stuff, right? Like you can really get in there and sort of mess around and be very specific about what you want to do. And often other programs like, yes, it has scripting, but is it as advanced as Photoshop? Can you actually do those things? Does it take 5 extra clicks? Is it as easy? And I think the productivity, again, it seems like, that you're just nitpicking, right? This software does exactly the same thing. But when you're doing it hundreds and hundreds of times, and when you're looking for that productivity and that speed, it is often your ability to really sort of round off the edges of your process that will allow you to get more done. And as a professional, not blow your deadlines or spend time with your family on the weekend. I know I keep going to that, but that's where a lot of people are really struggling is, they're trying to get more work done. And if you could get more work done, not through some drastic thing, but just through reducing really boring, repetitive tasks or things that, just don't need to be done, just clicking on a million things, then, that's extra money, that's extra time, that's extra fun, it's extra time with your family and or just the people you love, whatever, playing video games. It's more time to, have a life, learn new things, whatever it is, right? You don't want to be spending your life clicking on pointless stuff a million times. Okay, that has been, if you're still with me, I do appreciate it because that is a lot of just sort of looking at very basic things. But hopefully that's been interesting. Hopefully you can see here like probably what we actually need. And I think a lot of us are just not going to care about most of that stuff because you're like, my life is in my future. I only see me saving out JPEGs, making art. None of that stuff matters. And quite frankly, it's pretty easy to learn Photoshop. So if you learn the basics of digital art and then you want to pick up Photoshop, it's really easy. There's plenty of learning resources. None of it's a big issue. There's no real like, if you don't use Photoshop in the beginning, you're never going to become a professional. But I think it's really important if you're thinking and you're just sort of really annoyed at Adobe, I'm going to quit. I'm going to go to, I often really have these desires to just, I'm going to set up a Linux workstation. I'm going to use all the open source software. I'm like, I think it'll work. Yeah, I think, again, you get a little bit into that and you realize how many bugs there are and how much of that is not me making art and how much longer it's going to take and just the actual ramifications that has to my real life, right? Which, again, is super important to understand. So next, what I want to do is look a bit closer at Adobe as a company and try and understand this in more detail, because I think there's a lot of things that people who are talking to artists aren't talking about these things. And I think when you see Adobe sort of messing with a lot of this AI stuff, we're just sitting here as creatives going, what on earth is going on? Like, why are you doing this? And I think if you actually look at Adobe as a company, I think we can understand some of these actions a little bit, and hopefully that will give more clarity to our decisions and allow us to make better decisions about, whether we want to sort of continue this relationship with this company. I mean, if we look at the history, for me, right, it's always been one of these sort of quote unquote evil companies. It's always been a company that seemed very aggressive. It's always been pursuing a monopoly, less focused on like really making each of the products good, but mostly trying to sort of smother the competition and sort of build these creative suites, these products that kind of work together. And it's a good idea. And I think that if you look at like how a lot of it has sort of turned out, like it's not the worst for the customer, the people who use the product, but they are one of these companies that from the very beginning, you've just been like, I got to deal with Adobe, right? Traditionally they bought companies like Macromedia. They bought out Macromedia. And then, which was a web developing kind of software. And then they kind of just killed it, right? And got rid of it. And you're just like, what happened? Half of those programs went away. Like, I knew how to use those programs back in the day. I don't know why, but I did. Making websites with Dreamweaver and stuff. And, it's all gone. It's very frustrating. So, like my understanding of Adobe is like, this is not a nice, cozy company, right? There's not a lot of brand equity there for me. I have very little investment. And I have frequently tried to get out from it, right? Being like, oh, let's go to Corel Paint, or let's try these other things. It's always been one of these companies, right? But that doesn't change where it's going, right? And the degree to which at some point you have to like get out of the boiling water, right? Before you get cooked. But I think the real key thing to understand, I guess, like how I would view what's going on, and I have no insider information, this is purely conjecture, but this may be worth considering, is that Adobe is, because I think it really goes to the core of how software may sort of continue and some of the problems that Adobe's in, because I think they're in trouble. I think they are this obviously legacy software company. So they're used to selling discs or floppy disks, CDs, DVDs with software on it. And you install that on your computer, you activate it, whatever. That's where they come from. It's a legacy software company. And really in today's age, that is a dinosaur of a company. If you look at how most software is being developed these days, it's not being developed as downloadable things you install in your computer and you activate. It's all what's called software as a service, or SaaS. And that's where you've got programs like Figma or Notion are the good ones. I'll sort of refer to those. Figma is a Adobe XD sort of competitor, which is UI UX design. And it's basically like a program where you can kind of design a whole bunch of stuff, but mostly for sort of the web. But it's online, and you mostly are able to just sort of view it as you can view it through the web browser, something like Figma. You just design stuff, put notes, you can collaborate with giant teams, do reviews, people can modify stuff. I don't have a lot of experience with it, but my understanding is like the cool kids use Figma, right? They do not use Adobe stuff quite so much, and that's kind of where the world is going. And in a similar way, you've got an application like Notion, which is kind of a writing/productivity tool. It kind of lives in the cloud. Your data lives in the cloud. You can have an app on Windows, Mac, Android phone, iOS, tablet, right? You view it in a browser. You can use it anywhere, anytime. It updates. You type something in one window, it appears in the other instantly. It's like super functional. And people love Notion. They love Figma. They're using them a lot. Adobe tried to buy Figma for $20 billion and they get knocked back because I think it's essentially antitrust. So that's where the world is going, is software as a service, for better or worse. Again, we'll talk about, how maybe that's not the best thing. It's certainly not the best thing for data privacy because all your data by default lives on the cloud. So Adobe is this kind of legacy company that has tried to transition to a SaaS company, and they've kind of led the way. And they've also sort of led the way despite their users kicking and screaming, not wanting this. No one wanted a subscription model. Everyone saw subscription models coming. No one who was using these products wanted it. Again, for better or worse. But Adobe really has struggled, and you can see they are massively struggling to be a proper modern SaaS company. They have these subscription models, but it doesn't really work. It's sort of a clunky implementation of cloud. And you can see that the other thing that really is a major problem for me with Adobe is how they don't seem to have a really good roadmap forward. They have this legacy software system. They're obviously trying to include cloud, back when cloud was like a cool name, whereas no one talks about Figma or Notion being in the cloud. They just sort of talk about like, this is software. This is how people do stuff. We don't need to know it's in the cloud. That's how old Adobe is they're still talking about clouds. They're still talking about big data. And it's a $20 billion company. I think it makes, so $20 billion a year or something. $200 billion company makes $20 billion a year. It's a big company. It's publicly traded. All these publicly traded companies just really can't take care of their customers anymore. I just think fundamentally they're not very functional at really building good products because they have so many different customers, so many different shareholders. There are business customers to Adobe's sort of business, right? That are enterprise customers they don't use any creative apps. They use a lot of these sort of data analytics aspects of the business. And I think this is also where, again, trying to describe how I sort of view the company and how that sort of affects whether or not it's worth us still using Photoshop, which is a fractional part of the company. But they've been trying to transition to a proper SaaS company, but they're also stuck in this Silicon Valley hype cycle of all this just kind of nonsense where I think in order to stay relevant, right, in order for the emperor to have clothes, they have to keep pretending that they're not this legacy dinosaur software company that's just trying to sort of, instead of sending CDs, it's sending, packets through your Creative Cloud installer or whatever. So they've often been, you look at a lot of the other business structures they have are very much around the big data style of, sort of hype that was around a couple of years ago. And a lot of that, I don't know whether that sort of panned out, but I think I'm guessing, again, I'm just guessing that they kind of have to do that stuff to stay relevant, to feel as if, the company is actually like a tech forward positive company. So they have to pretend that they are a modern tip of the spear, on the razor's edge, the avant-garde of sort of technology and innovation, which they kind of were back in the day. But they're obviously not now. And you can see that from both what they're doing and, the basic structure they have and their inability to really become what I would consider to be a true SaaS company. And I think this is sort of really important to understand. The way that software becomes interesting and people really use it, as I said, I think is through the symbiotic relationship between the community that supports it. And this is an idea of like community involvement, communities having real stake in companies. That is an interesting sort of thing that was talked a lot about in the last Silicon Valley hype cycle, which was the blockchain, where the idea was that kind of through blockchain technology, you would be able to kind of track a lot of user involvement and the stake that people had in particular companies based on, potentially just who is contributing a lot to the community. And there's this idea that you kind of have with these companies that are publicly traded, like Instagram, a lot of these meta sort of products, Facebook, where there is a company and the company, sort of builds this product, but really it is the people that build the product. It's us as artists and everyone else who make content for Instagram that makes it what it is. Without the content, Instagram is very boring. Same with Facebook. If we're not on there, it's very boring. And a lot of people have really helped to build these platforms and products up in the same way you did with something like Photoshop. So the problem is a lot of these things just become publicly traded and they sort of run out of their venture funding and they need to find funding somewhere. And obviously, publicly traded companies, large companies, start caring more about share price and what the shareholder wants, not what the customer wants. And this is, to a certain degree, just a particular cycle that these companies go through. And it really makes the companies no good because they do need the community to support what's going on. It's not just this transactional thing where like you buy a bar of soap and then you use the soap. It's like there's an interaction that occurs with a lot of these companies that's really key. So anyway, we're going a bit into the weeds, but I think this is really key to understand. Maybe not particularly related to Photoshop, but to how I think a lot of the industry will go and what we should be looking for. So there is this idea that is part of the sort of blockchain ethos that you can potentially track participation and early participation of people who use products. And that is something that will be taken into consideration when it comes to what direction those companies will go to. And it's basically saying that because people who use products in a company are such an important part, that they will actually become major stakeholders in that company and will be able to direct where it goes and what rules there are. So a good example of that would be that maybe if we look at a more utopian software future, the next Instagram, the people who really get on it early on and build it, the people with a lot of stake in it, will actually get to choose which features get rolled out. And maybe they won't let you just kind of mix with the timeline because that's not what the people who are actually using it want. So there's the idea that it is possible through technology to track who is actually invested in and supporting a community and part of a community, and that will be the only kind of software application and community that you would ever want to be involved in, because obviously you can see that these large corporations that start off being built by a good community end up being publicly traded, and then they just kind of sell that community off, right? And just slowly degrade their brand value to nothing. And, it's sort of tricky to figure out, how that's going to work. But normally it doesn't work out very well for anyone. So where am I going with all of that? The key here is that often these companies, even though they're very big, and to us, right, the symbiotic relationship you can kind of imagine is it's not some sort of equal relationship. It's not something where we have power. It's like these companies are these big giant whale fish, and we're these tiny little squiggly fish that kind of, there's millions of us, and we're all sort of going there like picking the dirt off them and cleaning them, so that we can eat the dirt. That's a little bit more like the symbiotic relationship I kind of imagine. And it's kind of no good. But also, these companies are actually beholden to Wall Street, to the shareholders, and that's a very hard game to play. And even though these people get paid a lot of money, I think the problem is that it doesn't matter how much money you get paid, you're still put in these situations where you kind of often just have to do silly things. And so I think you can clearly see that Adobe has tried to jump on all of these Silicon Valley hype trains like big data. I don't know whether they really got into blockchain, but they're certainly on the AI one. And you kind of have to do this, because what will happen is AI comes along, you see a whole bunch of hype for AI where, now maybe stock footage is not going to be a thing because you can just make your own image, which is kind of true. That has happened with AI. A lot of people, instead of using cheap stock footage, just use AI for thumbnails and stuff like that. It tends to be more effective for people. Again, that's just what's happening, right? You can forget the ethics of it. That's just what's happening. So a lot of investors are going to say, maybe Adobe's in trouble because their stock business, which I think is like it's hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't think it's $1 billion or whatever, but it's quite a lot of money. Maybe that's worthless. And then you kind of think, well, maybe Photoshop's worthless too, right? Because now you can just do what Photoshop does, but you couldn't do it in AI. And you could see there were a lot of early AI tech demos of people saying, hey, you can just select a bit of the image and then just modify that. It's not just this kind of, potluck thing where you throw it, whatever. So I think a lot of what you're seeing with them using AI, and again, this is purely conjecture. This is purely just armchair quarterback stuff. For what it's worth, I think a lot of that is just them having to signal that they are still this tech-forward company. In a similar way, do you see probably a lot of that big data stuff? The company got very much into, if you look and go and look at different products that Adobe offers besides Creative Cloud, I think this is also very rough because you can't just easily get this information unless you troll through a bunch of financial reports. But I think like the Creative Cloud stuff is maybe like 60% of revenue or something like that. Again, I could be way off, but there's a bunch of other stuff they make. There's billions and billions of dollars that are done through data analytics and stuff where you're tracking your customers for like large enterprise corporations. And that was all part, I think, of the big data push that, again, everyone was jumping on. Didn't really go anywhere, but still there's a lot of money in it. They made a lot of money. They're selling these products to enterprises. So they're very much into big data and trawling things and scraping data and finding data. So, you can kind of see how they would easily get into AI and be able to understand that. Obviously have stock footage. So I think you can see that a lot of the reasons these things happen are just because they're trying to stay relevant when it comes to AI. Because if they don't put AI in their products and they don't say, hey, no, we're on the AI train, we've got something unique, like, watch out for us, a lot of people are just going to tank the share price. And regardless of reality, it's just going to go to zero because the share price doesn't have any real impact on reality. It's just this kind of fancy game that people on Wall Street play. And, at least, again, that's just sort of armchair quarterback. I'm an artist. So, I think what you're seeing much more is this old legacy software company that's struggled to transition to a proper SaaS company. It's lost all, I would say, of its brand equity and people actually caring about it or having any real affinity for it. And it's looking like a dinosaur. And then AI comes out and AI is going to completely destroy the entire company. And I guess this is something that is sort of worth looking at that we'll kind of, jump into in the next section. But I think that really is the key. And I think that's actually super interesting and speaks a lot to, again, the problems you have with a big company like this that, as I said, is really struggling and is having to signal like crazy that it's still relevant in a very, very quickly changing world where, look, we can view them as being this big evil corporation, but, they could easily be very quickly in trouble from a share price point of view. And when that happens, again, like bad stuff happens, you have to change a bit. You have to be seen to change. You have to cut people. That's why a lot of these layoffs happen. Is just you had to be seen to cut people. Otherwise, you're probably not being financially responsible. So a lot of these people just cut. And it's the same thing. You have to change or make it seem as if you've got a new play or you're going to go with the new hype thing. Because a lot of these companies are in trouble, right? They're not making as much money as they should. And again, there are a lot of software SaaS products that are actually heavily competing with Photoshop and maybe not Photoshop specifically, but other Adobe products. And you can see the writings on the wall. They're in big trouble. That's why they were kind of trying to buy Figma. So anyway, I think hopefully that reframes Adobe a little bit. And that's kind of how I see them, at least. Old tech company struggling desperately to stay relevant. All right. So where does this go, right? Like how can we kind of take a bunch of that stuff and look at more where things should go? And specifically, I want to take a look at the ethics of this. Really thinking about what a good relationship between people who use software and people who make software should be. I think one of the challenges here is that often people are imagining that we should be able to get a lot of this stuff for free. And if you just think about that, it's just logically not going to work. Yes, a lot of these large corporations do make this obscene amount of profit, but they're also spending obscene amounts of money on people to make this software, to make all of these things. And that's still the case if it's just a couple of people making a smaller software program. Just a team of 2 or 3 or 10 is going to cost a huge amount of money, and people need to be able to live in order to make software. It's really basic. I think there's this assumption that because some people are using particular business models that everyone should be able to. And I think, again, a good example of this that we'll talk about is how Procreate has a really good business model that seems to work for everyone because it has this really low barrier to entry. It's a very small price, but again, they seem to be able to manage that as a company. But again, there are limitations to that I would imagine would define what the software probably could be or how much they can expand. And that is certainly a risky proposition. You should not expect like, oh, that will keep working. All it often takes is a couple of changes in the wind or the way people view something or something else comes along to compete with it that, those companies can be in big trouble. Even if you've only got 5 people, if you're not making enough new money, then you have to get rid of them. And then all of a sudden you're not adding new features, you're adding less features and things tend to spiral down. So I think it's really interesting to look at how, firstly, before we sort of get into the ethics, I think it's important to look at how often these programs are created. As I said, I think this is a really key thing to understand by the users and the people who are helping to build the software features by beating against it, smashing against it, making it all, sort of getting rid of all the kinks and sort of pushing it forward and really providing enthusiasm and feedback. You can't really build that type of software in a vacuum. And I think that's often the difference between, again, a program like Procreate on iOS, where it has had so many people using it because so many people use it, so many people make tutorials in it. And, that means you actually get a very robust, good working software program that's, again, I think there's always going to be limitations to it based on the interface. But yeah, you actually get a really good product and everyone's kind of happy with it. And again, the reason that Photoshop, I think, got to that space and the reason that a lot of other programs were sort of built off the back of Photoshop to a certain degree, it still was the industry standard, the thing that people had to have. And it was the Photoshop interface that really built Adobe, because before they had so many different software programs, they only had sort of 1 or 2. And it was really when they sort of made InDesign to compete with Quark Express that they kind of leveraged the Photoshop interface. Everyone knew how to use Photoshop, but they were often using 5 other different software programs to do other different things. Some would be using Adobe Illustrator, but some would be using Macromedia Freehand or whatever the other sort of option was. But when they started to say, hey, if you all know how to use Photoshop, everyone knows Photoshop, the Photoshop interface is quite good. They had a lot of patents on that typical thing. So they were able to kind of really leverage that and build other software. And then at some point you were like, well, look, it's going to be easy for me to use InDesign because it's kind of like Photoshop and I can import my Photoshop files. And they were really trying to build that monopoly. But a lot of what built that was people coming along for the ride and people initially helping them to build Photoshop into a good platform by using it a lot. And I think it's really important to understand that a big part of that was the fact that you could pirate it. And that can't be overstated. And I think one of the big problems they're having is that they still view that as this negative thing. People are so upset about the pirating and not being able to control it. They don't understand that is actually what built the entire company. The entire thing is built upon the back of piracy, in my humble opinion, right? Again, don't sue me. Just that's what I think happens, right? Is when you have these low barriers to entry and everyone can use it, it's more fun for people to use it. It's easier to skill up in it. You're more likely to actually have it in your professional production workflow as a company because everyone else knows how to use it. It just becomes this kind of good symbiotic relationship. Everyone's like, yeah, we all win. When you take the free version out, you get what you've got now, which is that people don't know how to use Photoshop. They don't care. They don't start using it. So I've been using it forever and I have no reason to kind of switch. It does everything I want, but we have kind of noticed, I was teaching in university environments for, quite a while and you get, 100 to 150 students, 110, 120 new people come in every year and you see kind of what they're doing. It was very clear people weren't using Photoshop. People were, pretty recently, this wasn't, not in the last sort of 5 years, but, previous to that, you really see people start to be using Paint Tool Sci. They'd be using Clip Studio Paint or Manga Studio or whatever it was called. There's a couple of other ones. Or they just have been used to using something on their iPad, right? Again, like Procreate. And that's kind of what they started using because they could get it cheaply and just jump in and make art. And it was this one-time payment. And I think that's where you really see Photoshop's actual market share start to disappear. And people start to view the brand poorly because you can't get into it. You can't sort of get used to it. And I think the gentleman's agreement is ironically a little bit very similar to what actual modern SaaS companies all do, which is they have a free tier. And the general understanding was like, I'm not making any money out of this Photoshop thing. I don't even know where I want to go with this, but I'm going to learn to use it. And, when you kind of start making money, you buy a copy, or you start working in a company and they buy a copy. So it kind of did actually work for everyone. And, probably there's, some sort of slip there, but yeah, I think that really does build a good relationship. And you can see, I think that's often what also builds a really good high quality professional product and a good brand, a good sort of brand equity, like people liking the company. And, it sort of makes a really good synergistic, to, steal a terrible business word, sort of symbiotic relationship between things. It builds a great community, great learning resources, great support. And I think that's exactly what you see with something like Figma or Notion, which are what I would consider, sort of modern iterations of software. They will have a free tier. And I think my advice to Adobe would be have a free tier for everything and provide 85 to 95% of the functionality of Photoshop and every single other thing you make. Give that away for free like everyone else does, right? I mean, that's the thing that I think creates the best of all worlds. I think as they got a monopoly, they're probably not going to do that because it would probably mean $1 billion lost because there's so many people who, because it's a monopoly, they kind of need it even though they don't really want it. And a lot of people who need it but don't really want it kind of just get a free version of Notion or Figma or whatever because they're just playing around with it. This more than anything is the real thing where I look at Adobe and I think like, this is not looking good. There's not really a good direction here. They don't seem really to be that tech forward in understanding how these things actually function. Now, I want to sort of dig a little bit into the price and the ethics and the AI stuff, though, because I think that's key. Now, and I think this will link to kind of what you get and how you see some of these products that are created by Adobe that I think are actually good, but I never knew about them, right? No one knows about them. No one cares. And I think it's really important to understand how to launch software and build software. And it's clear to me that Adobe kind of really struggles with that. I think the madness you see when you have these large publicly traded companies that are trying to diversify and have different customer bases, it's like, well, sometimes when you have different customer bases and you're into disruption and changing business models and stuff, it's like, well, you often see that you kind of need to support one customer by messing over another customer and stealing their job. And that just puts you in these massive ethical quandaries where there's no right or wrong answer. It's just all wrong, right? It's just lose, lose, lose all the way down for everyone. And, I think that's a real sort of problem that I see with these things is that you can see that Adobe didn't understand. And again, this is armchair quarterback, but they didn't understand what made Photoshop and thus all their other stuff good and thus gave them the monopoly to kind of create what they're doing. They've launched so many software applications trying to compete with things like Procreate, making Photoshop on the iPad, making this, making that, making like Photoshop Express, like the cheap version of Photoshop, just trying all these things. But none of it works because there's not a community around it, right? There's not genuinely a community of people who are interested and passionate about this software. There's not often a purpose to this software. I think often the customer segmentation is less about, here's an individual, let's build the best software for them. It's more like, well, here are the people who want Photoshop, but we don't want to sell it to them because they can't afford it. So let's make a worse version of Photoshop. And then you're kind of stuck there making a worse version of something. And it's not just giving a free version that, doesn't have pro features. It's really kind of getting people to learn off in a different interface, right? It's kind of this sort of madness of just randomly making applications and then they will cancel them and get rid of them. Photoshop Express, there was a bunch of iPad, iOS sort of apps they made. A lot of them disappear, they delete them, they get rid of them. They put features into Photoshop, like they had really early implementations of cloud that seemed pretty good. The promise was, and this was before you could really do a lot of the data stuff and really store like, terabytes of stuff in the cloud and have this collaboration. It was all pretty clunky, but there was this idea that you could store your settings in Adobe Cloud so that you could potentially have your Photoshop brushes, your Photoshop settings, all your Adobe settings, and they're just stored on your account. You download them, and then away you go. You just, anywhere you are, you just log in with your account. You paid for the software. It sucks down all your sort of settings, and then, it automatically saves them. And so that's like a magical thing, but it never worked that well because you always had to export and import. I never got it to work. Like it just didn't work. And then they took it out. They just like delete it. Same thing with 3D. They put 3D in Photoshop. I don't know who was asking for 3D in Photoshop, but yeah, in the end, they just took it out. So it's obvious to me that I think there's not a good understanding of how a lot of the success happens. And they're often making applications at Adobe that kind of don't really go anywhere. And they don't seem to understand why. I think often the why is that you get people to use it and to beat on it and to iron out the kinks and figure out what this thing actually is. So a good example of this is actually, and again, this will tie into the next point, which is the price. I think a lot of people, again, complain about the price of Photoshop, of whatever. And this is so much dependent on where you are. Again, if it's $1 and you don't have $1, it's unaffordable. It's too much. You can never afford that. For a lot of professionals, though, like personally, I have lots of these SaaS software accounts that I have for different things, like Notion. And I pay a certain amount for that. And I think the real problem is you actually get quite a bit with Adobe Creative Cloud these days. The price you pay for it, there is the recommended retail price, and then there's the actual street price. And the street price will change depending on how SaaS churn is going, how many people are like quitting and joining. And often they're incentivized, the people who will be on the phone or the chat or whatever it is, to retain you. Because for them, it doesn't really matter. If you leave, they get zero money. If you stay, they get money, right? So they kind of want you to stay. There's the price that you pay that's on the sticker. But, for instance, this will kind of tie some of these things together. I quit my cloud thing. I just went down to Photoshop and Lightroom because I was like, why am I paying for like InDesign, Premiere? Like, I don't use any of this stuff. I started using DaVinci Resolve instead of Premiere. Haven't used any of this stuff for ages. Just a waste of money. I'm going to stop doing it. And then I had to do something which is a pretty common task. We were trying to show people what like a finished sort of hardcover would look like for our Star Atlas core comic. And I was mocking it up. And I'd done this before in Kickstarter. And I just kind of like, it's just easy for me to paint it. I know you can do it in 3D. You can mock it up. But I was like, I'm just going to paint a very bad version of the box and stick the box cover on it. It kind of looks all right. I was like, I'll do this for that. And my creative director was like, no, don't, that looks crummy. Just use this. And it's a program called Adobe Dimension, I think. And it's part of the Creative Suite. And he was like, this is what I use. And I was like, I don't have Creative Suite. I'll go get it again. Because again, right, this is money. This is my job. And this is a situation, I'm in a fully remote company. And I buy all my software. I pay for everything. And I kind of support all that stuff myself. So, it's not like the company's paying for it, but it's kind of like, the company is paying for it. I need this in order to do my job. I was like, it's going to sign back up. But I'd heard a lot of people say, hey, if you cancel, they'll try to give it to you for less. And I was like, well, I reckon I'm just going to go on there and ask them whether they can give me a better price. And I was expecting a lot of drama, but I just went on there and kind of just said, like, can I get it for a better price? And they gave me like a crazy discount. I reckon I'm paying less for Adobe all apps with 100 gigabytes than I am for most other SaaS products that I own that provide way, way less functionality. You get all these apps, and they've got more apps there. Again, there's this app called Adobe Dimension. And it's an app that seems specifically designed to give 3D functionality and good rendering functionality that kind of works on a GPU to people who aren't 3D native. So that's kind of me. Like, I know how to use 3D programs, but really getting a good render out of a 3D program requires setting up lights, really sort of making a good 3D model. Whereas they have a lot of these templates where you just basically get a product presentation book template and you can change the size, you can sort of change where they are, you can move them around, it's pretty cool. And you don't have to know much 3D. It's a really weird app. Like, I'm like, this thing's great if you need to do that. I've literally never heard of it once in my life. And I think that's the problem, is that Adobe has actually a really good deal. If you're a professional. If you're not, you don't have the money, it's like too much money, right? Anything's too much money. You need the free tier of that. But for a professional, you get this amazing deal. I mean, the Adobe Creative Cloud, and again, this is me, maybe not reading the room, let me know, but I think it's a great deal. You get video editing, you got Premiere, After Effects. I mean, those things they do work. They're pretty good. InDesign. You've got Acrobat to wrangle PDFs. You get Photoshop. You get all this other stuff. You get XD if you do need to do UI UX. And then you get all these other apps that you probably never heard of. Like, all this stuff. You get access to, the iPad, whatever it is. The new sort of iPad painting app they have, Fresco. You get cloud storage. It should be good. It actually is like a really good idea. Cloud storage, all these things sync. What's the problem? The problem is they have this monopoly and all this stuff is behind a paywall, and I don't think that many people use it. And I think then what happens is the software doesn't really get that much better. Not that many people are using it. I mean, there's not that many good tutorials on there that I could kind of find for like how Dimension works or whatever. I mean, it's pretty easy, but there's not that community that you get with something like Notion or Figma, or that you had with the original Photoshop, where 80% of the people who were using it weren't paying for it, but we were all trying to make it better. And we were all aspiring to be able to become professionals so we could afford it. And I think that's so important to understand is, I think we should be paying for software. You should probably pay as much as you possibly can because that will provide better software. It's tricky when it's a big company like Adobe, but I think it's actually a really good deal. It's a crazy deal, especially if you get a good discount on it. You get all this functionality. If you don't use it, that's fine. Maybe they only need Photoshop one or two things, but you get a lot of power to make things. The problem is it's really hard to make those products really good because I just don't think that many people are using them. I don't think you really figure out some way to hear about it. And it's just really hard to actually understand what the actual value proposition is there for a creative. The other thing to remember is that it's very easy when we're looking at these big companies like Adobe to view them as being capital E evil, because they do behave in a lot of these ways where they are kind of anti-consumer, anti-customer, and it's impossible to figure that out. And also, if a company is a little bit bigger, they are often going to try and do more of these things. And I think this is a trap you see other software companies, and I'm not really going to name any particular ones, but some have gone to subscription models. And a lot of this is because running these companies is very tricky. You can easily see how, if you just hire a few too many people when things are going well, and then maybe no one upgrades to the next version of your software or whatever, you're in trouble. You need to keep that consistent revenue. And I think if companies are even just a little bit poorly managed in terms of how quickly they expand, because again, following a lot of these hype cycles, you're always meant to expand, get bigger, get better. More stuff is better. And often it just means they bite off more than they can chew. The revenue is just not there. And then they got to go find it with like making the prices higher, adding subscription models. It is really tricky. But also remember that behind all of this are companies where there are people who genuinely are aligned with our interest and are making software and really care about the features. And I'm sure there are thousands and thousands of people like that at Adobe who are spending their whole life making software for creative professionals and thinking about the creative professional and people who just want to make stuff, the artists. They are there, right? There's plenty of people in Adobe. There's plenty of people making all of these applications, and they really do want to make amazing things. And we should want to support them to do that. But it's important to understand the limitations of how you support a company. So going back to something like Procreate, if we do view it as, okay, this is a company who's giving you this great offer, and their customer really is the beginner artist, the person who probably, look, if I was to hazard a guess, I'd say like the vast majority of people who buy Procreate don't use it much. They're not using it even every day. They're just kind of buying it. And it works perfectly for that. It's actually a really good application. It feels really good to use. That initial time you kind of use it is really good. But I think to add more of that functionality that you would get in Photoshop and make it more of a professional app for a larger group of people, you would reduce some of that initial, like, hey, this is fun and easy to use and simple and it doesn't have a bunch of menus. I think there's just inherently something about these professional apps where it's like being in a factory. You look at Maya or ZBrush or whatever. There's just a million buttons. There's a million things. Even people who use them all day don't know what half of it does. But, when you need to use it, it's there and it functions and you can actually do the job. And the art that we produce is the thing we save. It's the thing we make, not the experience we have while we're doing it. And that's what you want when you're a professional, is something that does the job, that, makes your life easier. That's just never going to be aligned with the person who wants the best experience the first time they load the app. So you're never going to see those things align because the number of professionals out there is very small versus the number of people who just enjoy drawing and digital art. So you can have these business models that work where, like, yes, it's a very small entry price. Yes, everyone sort of enjoys it. There's enough new people coming in every month, every week, every day who want to just play around with it and try it. They're happy to pay $15, $10, but, they're maybe not going to use it that much. There's enough for them to support that company and that team going forward. As soon as that stops, though, they're going to have to figure out some way to, make more money. Subscription, put out another version, whatever, like that'll happen. But you can see that business model will work really well as long as they keep making the software really suited to a particular type of artist, and there's enough new people coming on board every week to support it. And it's very possible that will continue forever. But I think if you are looking for something that is much more specific or much more of a professional focus, you probably are going to have to pay more for it if you just think about the simple economics of that software probably needing a larger team and there being less actual users who are really sort of working towards it, sort of building it and supporting it. And this is where, again, the way that the symbiotic relationship works is really important to pay attention to. When you're looking for a company that you want to support, you have to look at who else is using that software, because who's using the software will direct how it goes and what features get added and what features get left till the next release. And that's why I think it's really important to understand that although you can see alternative products that like, oh, it's kind of almost as good, or it has most of the functionality, but if the people who are supporting that software and are essentially, unofficial stakeholders in the company, because, they're the ones who are always sort of pushing it, right? If they get 100 requests for a particular feature from people who aren't aligned with your interest, you're going to find the software kind of drifts away from what you actually need it to do. And I think with Photoshop, you're actually seeing not just like where that wants to go now, but you're seeing a legacy of features being added and things being created where the software has amazing functionality and it's hard to replicate. Often you can see from feature requests on something like a Procreate forum where people are like, hey, let's add new features, is people who are at the company sort of fielding questions and saying like, hey, we'll add this feature to this thing, really don't even understand what people are requesting. There was one that was interesting where I was looking at, obviously one of the things Procreate doesn't do is allow you to grow or expand the selection. And people were asking this and saying, like, this is a fundamental feature we need. And this is the thing you get where like someone's asked for that in Photoshop and they've like really been like, no, this is what we need. This is why we need it. We need it for this reason. It needs to work this way. No, like make it this feature, right? And they kind of just build this thing over time and they make it work. And then you got this ability that's like super useful and really robust. And you sort of compare that to something like Procreate where it looks like the people who are fielding that feature request don't even understand why you would even need that or why that's important. Because most people who are just painting don't need to grow or expand a selection by 1 pixel or half a pixel and feather that. Right? But because Photoshop has had that like massive development time, it kind of has all those features and it's very tricky to understand how you're actually going to add all those kind of features into another program and really make them function in the same way, because it's tricky for a lot of people actually building software to understand why it's going to be used. And the amount of data, the amount of people who are using it, the different reasons they might want to use it is really sort of tricky, I think, for a lot of people to understand. For instance, that is probably like growing or shrinking a selection, and having very fine control over that is something probably that was much more to do with photo editing or, sort of creating masks and that kind of stuff. But I can use it in a line and color process very effectively to automate the flatting process. So I'm using it for a reason that was never intended, but because it's such a robust feature and it works so well, it's very easy for me to just kind of, easily use it that way. So again, lots of other software might have that feature, but we're talking about a complete, sort of set of things that are really, really useful. And it's not obvious and not destiny that every software program is going to just, become the be all and end all. And I think Photoshop is that, but it's only that because it's been worked on for so long. And I think it's actually very hard to replicate that. Even if you just try and copy every single feature, you find they don't often actually work exactly in the same way. And there's a robustness to the way that Photoshop works that I think is very, very hard to replicate. All right, so that's probably enough of talking about, the company and where I think a lot of these things are going and some of the challenges with actually selecting different software. The real reason that most people are annoyed at Adobe, I think, this time is the AI. So I think it's worthwhile looking at that, because I think the AI actually tells me more about the company and where I think they're going, and the fact that I think they're in big sort of trouble. And this looks much more like sort of panic mode. And again, that kind of mad craziness that you get with these large publicly traded companies where they're trying to sort of please everyone. And in the end, I don't think maybe they're going to please anyone. Now, much of this will probably depend on how you view AI and whether or not you think it is a little bit hype, mostly hype, or total hype. I actually think we can tell a lot by what Adobe is doing here. Now, it's also good, I think, to separate out what I would call the AI hype and these concepts of, AGI or artificial general intelligence, and this concept that these things are going to get super smart. It's all going to go vertical. You won't believe what's going to happen next, and this has changed everything, and the world's never going to be the same, and all those other sort of clickbait headlines and stuff. So I think this is very much at the root of why Adobe is doing what it's doing. is the hype. Again, I've sort of discussed a little bit of why I think they have, done that with the stock footage and why they're adding it to Photoshop, and probably why they'll add it to everything is to stay relevant. But I think it also sort of tells us a lot about how these companies actually think it's going to work. And it gives a little bit of insight into the general kind of AI hype. Because if you really believe the hype, and the hype is real, and that's kind of the train that Adobe is riding to say, hey, we're this cutting edge technology company. Which, if you believe even a little bit of the hype, is not going to be the case. If you believe most of the hype, there will be no interfaces, there will be no Photoshop, there will be no nothing. There would be no more computer applications at all. It'll be one interface. You've just got a chat interface and you just talk to whoever it is and you just tell them to do stuff. Hey, you don't have to select a thing in Photoshop, right? You just have to tell the AI to change the thing in Photoshop, or just do it itself, because it's going to be super powerful, super intelligent. It's going to be able to track your eye. You can point to the screen. It'll tell, it's going to be super smart, right? You got to remember the hype here is that we're going to get to AGI. It's going to go vertical. And then once you get to AGI, you're going to get to superintelligence, and then it's Skynet and all this kind of nonsense, right? So again, if half of that is true, you're not going to need a computer interface at all. There's going to be no Adobe. It's completely disrupted industry and company. The whole concept of software goes away in a heartbeat, right? In a day, because superintelligence just gets to a point where it can just deploy a whole bunch of different things, and very easy for you to just kind of point at a thing, describe a thing. It'll be able to make anything photoreal, can do it animation. Like the hype is there where basically they're saying this thing can do anything. And the obvious conclusion is, you do not need a computer interface. You don't need a complicated computer interface. You don't need any interface. You just will write software on the go, right? You open up your iPad and you say, I'd like to do this today. Make me some software for it. And it should be able to just be like, I wrote that for you. Here it is. And as you speak, the software will change and morph. I want to be able to do this. Can you make this brush more like the way that, Rembrandt's brush looked, back like 500 years ago? And it's so smart. It's going to be able to do it all. You'll be able to write the software on the fly. There's no interfaces. There's no companies. There's just this megalithic Skynet style OpenAI corporations, right? That's what they're saying. They're saying this thing's going to be really smart. They're not saying you're still going to need Adobe, and you're not saying you're still going to need Photoshop to modify a photo. I think the concept is that this is going to be so antiquated. It's going to be like horses and carts. Even more than that, right? It's going to be like stone tools, flint tools. It's going to be, sort of apes whacking each other with sticks. We're just going vertical, super intelligence, right? That's the hype train. If that's true, why is Adobe putting AI in Photoshop, right? It doesn't make any sense. I think if you really looked at the projections that they're kind of saying, then you would probably downsize the company by about 99%, get rid of everyone, and sort of just hope to hang on, by your fingernails, and maybe supply a couple of the last remaining people who, like people still ride horses. There'll be still some people who want to use Photoshop in an application. It's like retro gaming or something, and it might be a $500 million company, because it's all going away, because all software is going away. There'll be no need for any of this. You just pay for one subscription, you write your own software, whatever, right? So that is what I'm hearing. That's the hype. That's where you would future project it to go. Thus, there is no Adobe. There's no one. There's none of this nonsense. It all goes away. All goes to zero. So that's not happening. That's not what they're saying is happening. That's not what is going on. They're adding features to Photoshop that, look, I don't know whether anyone really asked for a better generative fill in Photoshop where you're doing this AI stuff, and I don't know how good it is. I've never used it. I have no interest in that whatsoever. I have very little interest in any sort of image generation AI stuff. It all seems very difficult to use and seems to give pretty poor results from everything I've sort of tried. So, I think that just tells you everything, that what they're doing is kind of just saying, well, obviously we need to say we're adding AI features to everything because that's what everyone's doing, and everyone's doing it. And in most cases, I don't know whether let me know in the comments if you use most of these AI implementations to SaaS products, they're pretty terrible. Every single one I've used is immensely deficient to just using your sort of main chat GPT or whatever the actual kind of like most advanced model is. Every implementation is worse than that and almost not worth using. Notion actually has AI in it, and again, it's not that good. It's okay, it's not that good. So, I think it's going to be the same with Photoshop. Is anyone actually asking for that stuff? No, but you need to do it. Otherwise, people are going to worry that you're not on the AI hype train, and therefore it's not working. But again, a lot of these companies have, AI design tools, like you sign into your thing and you can just sort of tell it, hey, make me a brochure. It'll make you a brochure or whatever. So again, what you're seeing is a large $200 billion corporation not really acting as if that hype train is coming, but they're acting as if they have to pretend that it is for people who don't really understand much about AI, AGI, machine learning, or how any of these things function, or what you actually need to do to make things. So again, there's a lot of hype about you just being able to make games really easily and you can code games and, do all that kind of stuff. I'm seeing some things, but I'm not seeing anything even remotely close to the hype. And I'm not seeing it sort of increase or, exponentially grow that much. It still seems to have the same limitations. So that's where I'm coming from. You let me know if you think differently. I'm super interested to see, again, what everyone's kind of thinking. So I think basically what you're seeing here with Adobe is like them just really not understanding what's going to happen in the future. And either they're just doing it because they're on the hype train or they just really don't understand what's going on. But I think it's just a bad sign that the company is kind of confused and they're adding features and taking features away. So the number one reason that I'm kind of really like not that confident about Photoshop is not because of, I think other programs are going to be better or whatever. I'm like, no, Photoshop's really good. Adobe Creative Cloud's like a great deal. You get all this cool stuff. Thousands of people making software for us at Adobe, and they're making all these different new apps. They're trying really hard, making new things. And it's pretty cheap, relatively speaking. You get to, you're essentially buying a small part of like thousands of really high quality developers and software engineers and UI UX designers and stuff, and you get it for a very small amount. It's actually quite a good deal. I think the problem is that they have this history of like adding features, taking features away. I think it's the taking features away that's always a little bit of a worry, where you never quite know like when a company is kind of a bit struggling and seems a bit sort of frantic like that, not really thinking about which customer are we trying to serve or whatever. It's very easy for them to just torpedo their own products or, do sort of crazy stuff. You just don't know, right? It's like when you see someone acting crazy, you kind of just walk to the other side of the street. So that's kind of more where I view this is like, this is not a good sign. It's a real pity because Photoshop's pretty good. And, I after seeing a lot of the newer Adobe stuff, I would be more keen to be like, oh, Fresco looks pretty good. Oh, I can actually sync from Fresco to Photoshop. And I have a cloud. I already have 100 gigabytes worth of storage with them. Maybe I should get more. Maybe this would be really good. Because one of the things you find is syncing, and the cloud sort of solves a lot of this stuff. It's really annoying to have something on Procreate or Clip Studio or wherever it is. And then kind of even with the Clip Studio cloud integration is like it's not that nice. You kind of have to save and whatever. But the idea of like just having your files live in the cloud is actually really good from a functionality standpoint. It's terrible from a data privacy and like what if the power goes out? What if the internet goes down? It's terrifying in many ways, right? I'm not saying it's like some great thing, but like the idea is there. So part of me is like, look, Adobe's got new applications. They're building like Adobe Dimension. That's pretty good. I could use that. Maybe I should use InDesign because, I want to design some books and, maybe I should get more back into the ecosystem. And then they do this, and it's just crazy person sort of frothing at the mouth. Just like, okay, maybe I'll just walk away, right? That's kind of where I'm at, right? Again, let me know how that sort of sits with you. But yeah, Personally, I was like very sort of interested in, trying to learn more about Adobe Fresco, try and put more training in there. I feel like, the fact that kind of works, the brushes intermingle, like it sounds really good. I'm on board. I'm like, Adobe's back to, being like half a decent company. And then they just do this ridiculous stuff with AI that, again, it's a solution to a problem that I don't think anyone has or anyone is that interested in. And just speaks to, again, people adding features where they're not really clued into how people actually use the software and what they're actually trying to do with it, and the data privacy concerns and all that kind of stuff. It's just, it's not good. So anyway, that's kind of where I land on it at the end. Let me know what you think. How about some takeaways though? Because look, this has been pretty amorphous as is usual for one of these Visual Scholar podcasts. And, I've tried to not be too ranty, but this has probably ended up being a little bit ranty, a little bit sort of scatterbrained. I'm trying to give you, I guess, my thoughts on this, which are a little bit complicated. And I'm trying to give you also a bit of a counterpoint to what I see out there, on YouTube, where people are commentating on this and really sort of leaning into the outrage and sort of Adobe's an evil company. And I'm just like, no kidding, right? No kidding. Sure, right. None of this is news. And I think it's just not really worth getting too involved in that. That's kind of where I come from. It is certainly outrageous and ridiculous, but yeah, there you go. So how can we maybe look at this and do some takeaways and actually think about, okay, how do we go forward? What can we actually do? I think if we look at this from an analytical point of view, for me, again, from my experience, what I try and do is be super pragmatic about these tools. These are just things I use to do my job, to make my art. The way I view it, metaphorically and literally, is that the art will live forever, potentially. The software will not, right? Photoshop 4 that I was using and the computer I used to, learn stuff on, the various computers, the various Photoshops I've used, all this stuff is gone. But I still have the art that I made on all that. And that's always interesting to me that that's what sort of survives. I've gotten upset. I've changed program. I've, gotten really frustrated. I've gotten enraged at the ethics and the morality of it, which again is not to sort of, I think one of the most ironic things there is often the ethics and morality of not paying for software, right? And assuming that you're going to be able to get some software where other people are making a living from making that software. And they're real people. They got families and jobs and, things they need to do. To imagine that you can maybe not pay for that is kind of ridiculous and sort of get on your ethical high horse. That just doesn't make any sense. Again, I think we should find good relationships where you're happy to support a company, but still the idea that you're going to somehow just get it all for free is morally bankrupt, right? Ethically very questionable, obviously. And, I felt a lot of that sort of stress early on when I was, maybe, I don't know. I forget whether I was not paying for Photoshop. I know a lot of people were not paying for Photoshop. That might have happened. I'm not quite sure. But I think it's just important to be pragmatic. That's what I've learned over 25 years of using this stuff. It's just a tool. We can use it. It's actually very easy to reskill. If if Photoshop just disappears tomorrow, if your program of choice just disappears tomorrow, it'd be pretty easy for you to just learn something else, adapt, figure it out. But a big part of that is because a lot of other people would be in the same position. And a lot of other people would help you figure it out. And we'd work together to figure out what a good solution is. And I think that's often the thing that we forget, is that it's not just the software, it's who comes along with us and how we choose to support each other and support the larger structure, support the company that makes the software and really build something great. And so I think that's where I'd be less pragmatic is to really think about, okay, try and build good communities and good learning, good teaching, good, advice and sort of thought around the software program. But fundamentally, it's just a tool. Be pragmatic, use whatever works. Nothing really matters too much other than what we're doing, which is creating art. The other thing that's worth looking at from an analytical perspective is I really think it is probably likely that Photoshop will go away or be disrupted in some way, especially because it seems to be owned by Adobe. And although I think it is one of the major key linchpins in their entire strategy, it's still a very small one. And it wouldn't surprise me if, again, maybe they try and jam a whole bunch of AI nonsense into it just to kind of make a point and to signal to some other people who don't use the software that like they're a tech forward company. I mean, that's the real worry here. But, I think it's very likely that it could just disappear or become unusable or become frustrating. And look, even if you don't like the company, or even if you do like the company, it may be we're going to need to change, right? So that's kind of how I view it. And I really think if you look at the actions of Adobe, it just speaks to, a company that's fully divorced itself from trying to build a good brand and a good relationship with its customers. It's a very sort of hostile relationship. It doesn't feel good. And it's not cool anymore to, sort of use those applications. And yeah, that also is a bit of that writing on the wall. Crazy person, walk away, like let's get a parachute and see if we can, just make sure we can, get out of this plane if it starts going bad. So it's also important to understand, I think, really look at the AI thing, I think that tells you a lot that one of these massive, tech forward companies is kind of doing this stuff. And I think that is exactly what this whole AI thing is about. I think it's mostly hype. I think it's mostly just people trying to make money on the stock market, on Wall Street. And yeah, I don't know how much actual sort of stuff is there. Besides the actual, fact that probably for a lot of people it replaces stock footage. And it's probably going to be a better generative fill now that you have generative AI there. Yeah, it's interesting to see how that kind of plays out. But yeah, if the AI that they say is coming, it's coming, there's no Adobe. There's no software programs at all. It's all going to go away, and it's going to go away really quick when that exponential, the vertical thing happens, right? If you want a simple bro level version of this, it's that, bro, Adobe has always sucked. This doesn't really change anything, but yeah, they do seem to be getting extra sucky of late. All right, if we look at some super practical stuff, like what can we actually do? I think fundamentally use whatever software works for you. It's important, I would say, to not get sucked into outrage or hype or like FUD all in the headlines and everyone's like, I'm quitting, I'm doing this. Again, I think a lot of people are going to quit, then they're going to come back on the sly, right? A lot of this seems very sort of, puff chest, with, doing the monkey thing, making a big song and dance. I don't know how much of that is actually going to eventuate. Be really interesting to see if you do get a big exodus from Adobe. I think that will help build these other applications into better applications. And I think that's the second thing you can do is support the kind of software that really helps you to do what you do, and support it financially, support it by helping to build the community, and, really sort of tell people why you like it and, try and make it better. I think fundamentally, if we do that, it's going to lead to better outcomes for everyone. And I think the more that, again, sort of view it as a transition period as opposed to just jumping out of the plane without a parachute, yeah, I think the better everyone's going to be, quite frankly. Lastly, and this might be, again, ironically, a little bit of an unpopular opinion, but I think we should just, put our head down, make art, focus on the creative side of things. These software things are just tools. They don't really matter that much. And I think it is a real shame. If I look back again at the last 25 years, the amount of energy I've spent getting upset at software companies that are kind of seemingly doing dirty, it's just not worth it, right? At the end of the day, all that drama passes, all that outrage passes, all those emotions pass. And if you've actually done more art, then I think it'll make you feel better. Again, that's just me, but I think that's really, really important to remember. The art you make, you'll remember it. Probably you won't remember being outraged and annoyed at some silly company that wasn't very good anyway. In 10 years. If we look at this from, lastly, a philosophical or spiritual point of view, I think the real thing that we can take away from this is how corrupt and damaging the sort of corporate, publicly traded company thing is, and how it just does not serve everyone. It just creates these weird incentives where everyone's incentives are not aligned. You get a lot of win-lose and lose-lose scenarios happening with these large companies. And I really think it's going to stop, because I just don't think it produces actual results. I think a lot of these results that are being created are not real. There's a lot of energy happenings, a lot of wheels spinning, but it's not making power to the ground. It's not making better software. It's not being efficient. It's just kind of a lot of hype, a lot of nonsense, a lot of fuss. And it just kind of means that everyone's a little bit sort of unhappy and miserable. And I think there is something to where making really good things is about this symbiotic community aspect where you help build these things by using them, and that these companies do need good communities around them that actually like the product and engage with it to make it good. And I think that is probably what you're going to see with the next revolution of the internet. And I don't think that's got anything to do with AI or AI hype or anything like that. I think this is a major thing going forward, because we've all seen the dangers of putting a lot of energy into things like Instagram, software products like this, where you kind of become the product and you get sold down the river and no one really cares about you. And I think the future is going to be companies that actually take the communities that support them seriously, and that's the only place you're ever going to want to put your time and energy, because that is what we're doing as we use these programs. Yes, we're paying for it, but we're also paying through using. We're also supporting the company through using the product, helping improve it. And I think that transaction is not factored in. That thing is just taken for granted by the company, that you actually need people using it to make it good, and that the value of the free users is in building the community. And you can see that happen with most of these successful SaaS companies. Stuff like Notion, again, they build a good community and everyone loves that company, right? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you see there's heaps of people are positive about it, and people are building templates. There's tons of training. It's really easy to find out how to use Notion. And Notion is a very complicated program. It is not user-friendly in many ways, but the power it has is through the community. And I think that is very much accessed through the free version. I don't actually know how a lot of those things work on a real business level, because a lot of these companies have major venture funding, and it's not sure it's tricky to know whether or not that actually works from a business model perspective, because there's such hyper growth with those SaaS companies. But anyway, I think the future you can see really is not just in that, but in the people who use the product actually having some stake, some real control and stake in how the company goes. And I think there is going to be technology that kind of supports and tracks that. And I think the idea of engaging in a relationship like this with Adobe, where you as a consumer clearly can see the company not working for you, it's just going to be insane. The fact that you did that is going to be like flint tools and flint knives and horses and carts. And I think that's the interesting thing. I think that's a much more interesting way that I think the future will evolve, and how technology can help us to do that. And I really think that is gonna come pretty soon, because people are sick of it, right? We're all kind of sick of being treated this way by these companies and not having any real control over how the energy and the time that we've put into these things is just being, pulled out from under us and just taken for granted. So that'll be really interesting to see, because I think we're seeing the tipping point of that right now. And again, with a lot of these big companies, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. All right, that's what we've got time for this particular episode. Thanks so much for hanging around. If you are still here, I truly appreciate it. This one for me is a really sort of interesting topic. And I think, again, my basic vibe is just like, man, I just don't care. I've been here. I've done that. Adobe's a bad company. They've always been like one of these companies with questionable ethics and morals. I know that sounds like, you should be more involved in this. I really think I just don't care. I've learned to not care, get on with life, make art, and I'm genuinely interested in seeing what other options are out there. But for the reasons I've kind of stated, I'm not super confident that I'm going to be able to find something that truly replicates everything I'm going to do. And I think it's probably going to be a lot harder than we imagine to actually kind of, find something that does all of that. It's probably going to look like more than one application to really replicate what Photoshop can do. I think it is a really amazing program that's been built up over years by really, really good developers and people trying to figure out how to make a great application and building little features. It's very robust. Maybe we won't see programs that are that robust in the future, right? I think it's very hard to replicate that. So anyway, that's my thoughts. I'm kind of meh on this one, but hopefully that's helped you to be kind of meh and stress less about this as well. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Other than that, I'll see you around on the next one.